Hey, it's John Zockley here. I didn't want to appear on YouTube myself just because I didn't want to morph into one of those people that just want to see themselves on YouTube talking about obscure and strange political things. And I just didn't want to go there. But unfortunately, I've been dragged into this situation. And, people who know about my blog and know about my situation, they know where I'm going to be. They're in place before I go to certain places, and they strike up conversations with me, and drop hints. And 3 or 4 times, someone said to me, if you do a video on YouTube, you know, they go viral a lot easier than say a blog. That's the basic implication. Several times people said, yeah, I started a blog, I did a video on YouTube and it got 30,000 hits in the first week or something. So, I've been around doing this for a couple of years now, and I just figured out what kind of got to the bottom of it all. And so I figured maybe this would be a good time to do a video, even though I didn't want to do that. And my story is very confusing, so I'll just remind you now that you can read about my situation on my blog, communicationbysymbol.blogspot.com. Where it might be a little bit easier to digest what I'm going to do here. This might seem a little rambling. I've got an outline that I'm going by, and kind of do it in the order that from where things really, my life really started to get strange, and how when things dawned on me and I started looking back and figuring out what was going on. Things really kind of started going downhill when I lived with a woman named Christine Ferranda in the summer of 2007. That spring we had met online, and it wasn't until after I moved in with her that I realized how psychotic Christine was. She had a cupboard full of psych meds and muscle relaxers and Chantix to go with it. Her father's a cop who abused her mother, and she's very angry at men. She's an angry radical feminist, and she's a lawyer who defends corporations against frivolous workman's comp claims. I'm not for frivolous workman's comp claims, but knowing what I know now about her, it's quite clear that she pursued that job and specialty specifically for the purpose of targeting men. And I've come to the conclusion that she probably more or less hunts men online. I moved in with her, and she just started doing some strange things to torment me, and she knew she had me in a bad spot. And she claimed to be a succubus, which is some kind of demon, which, if you remember that, when I get to the end of this video, we'll touch on some things that are related to that. But she lived on the top floor of a 14-story luxury high-rise in Lakewood, Ohio. And she was in the most remote apartment in the building, basically. She was in a corner apartment so that there was, outside air on 2 sides of her apartment. On the other side of her apartment, the people who lived there moved out right after I moved in, which turned out to be a good thing for me. But at first it was strange when I figured out what was going on, because I figured out that there was, she could, there was no one around to hear anything that went on in the apartment. There was one person living in an apartment directly across the hall from her, supposedly, but I never saw her once the entire time I was there. I wouldn't be surprised at all knowing Christine now if she or maybe one of her associates rented that room out specifically for the purpose of making it look like someone lived there. They hang some kind of decoration on the door. It looks like someone lived there. I never saw anyone there in the 3 months I lived there. And in addition, Christine's building had trash chutes that led to a compactor and an incinerator. I'm not sure which. But the point is, after I figured out what was going on, it occurred to me that she could have killed me and dismembered me and dumped me down the chute, and nobody would ever know the difference. So things got a little really bad, or the signal for me to leave was when she dropped hints indicating that she was listening to my phone conversations. Because I had figured out what was going on, and I started making some calls home to see if there was a way that I could get someone to help me move. And the next day she dropped a hint, or that night she dropped a hint about, having access to my phone conversations. So the next day I called U-Haul, and And I went to the building manager and told him what was going on, and he allowed me to move into that empty apartment next door, which I did while Christine was at work. And then I left the next day. I had that U-Haul reservation while she was at work once again. And now in hindsight, I recall that the building manager, who was gay, it was nice of him to let me use that apartment, but I told him about Christine, and he didn't seem concerned about it one bit. And looking back now, I figured out that the brainwashing I've been subject to has been conducted mainly by gays, and part of their goal was to turn me gay. And Christine's a radical feminist, and I've learned that gays and radical feminists are working together. And it didn't occur to me until I decided to do this video, the significance of that, my experience with that manager. Because he kind of, I thought he was acting strange when it happened, and it never occurred to me, that he was really cool about letting me use that other room. And then, but, didn't seem to care one bit about what I told him about Christine. So I think there's probably some significance to that. And then, so I left there and I moved back to my hometown, which is Niles, Ohio, to live with my dad. And I started telling some friends on the phone about Christine. And that was when I started feeling like there were really some people following me around and people listening to my phone calls as well at my home there in Niles, my father's house I grew up in. And that was when, it was in the months after that, that would have been in, I think, early 08, when it started occurring to me that people are listening to my phone calls, etc. Christine also dropped a hint while we were together, indicating that she may have been working in collusion with my brother, and I'll get more, into things about my brother later. He's kind of at the center of all the things that have gone wrong in my life. I know that the lighting's a little bit different now. The continuity is not always going to be good in each of these videos, but I realized that I just wanted to give you a few details about Christine that I didn't do before. Christine, it's hard to explain some of the subtle things she was doing to torment me while I was living with her, but I'll just tell you some other things about her. She had 4 or 5 books about serial killers, and one was about cannibals, which when she started screwing with my head, she started leaving on the back of the toilet tank. She had, there's a movie called Monster with Charlize Theron, which is about Eileen Wuornos, a woman from Florida who killed like 7 men, something like that. On DVD, Christine had both the movie and the documentary about Eileen Wuornos. She had some other movies that had a lot of blood and gore in them. She left me to watch The Exorcist. We watched V together. She left me by myself to watch the movie The Ring, which is a good example of what they do to screw with your head. They've created these movies with they're nothing but like that movie is nothing but a clip show of disturbing images. Christine used to go to bed at night with the Versus channel on when they were showing like shows about video games with flashing blades and spurting blood. That's what she put on when she was going to sleep. And then she'd have like a picture-in-picture with a view of the entrance to her building. She could actually look and see who's at the door of the building. And then with all that in mind, when I first got suspicious, really concerned about Christine was the 3rd time she bragged to me with no prompting about how sharp her kitchen knives are. She said, "These knives are very sharp." And, she just brought that up to me out of the blue 3 times. After the 3rd time was when I kind of started adding things up and figuring out that something was wrong. And then later, I realized that on a visit to Florida, I think in 2004, 2005, my brother had done the same thing. for no reason at all. I said these knives are very sharp, and that happened to be the same brand of knives, I think Henkel or something like that. But yeah, so I just wanted to mention those few things about Christine and the connection to my brother. That's not the only comment she made that indicated she was working in collusion with my brother. So I just wanted to mention that. Okay, so as I mentioned, in early 2008, I told maybe a friend or two on the phone about Christine Ferranda and what I experienced with her, and it was around that time that I started noticing that maybe there was people following me around. Not that much, but it also became pretty clear that people were listening to my phone calls. Also, during that time, I read The Art of War, which I had been meaning to read for a long time, on the suggestion of some friends. And when I went to shop for it at Borders Books, there were several publications on the shelf, and I noticed one that had the same cover art and was the same publication as one my brother had when he was a teenager, maybe in his early 20s. And I got that one specifically for that reason. And as I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned in the first section or not, but Christine made some comments indicating that she was working in collusion with my brother. This caused me a lot of problems. And it was that when I read The Art of War that I figured out that my brother was doing some, I didn't know what at the time, but I knew my brother was doing some serious things, covertly ruining my life. So the next significant thing after that was in July of 2008, I got a job as a security guard at a steel mill in Warren, Ohio called Severstal. And at the during CPR training, there were a couple other guys there who ended up not working at the plant. One guy offered me child pornography, and I was like, or he told me there was someone else there who had child pornography that I could get it from. That's what he said, and I was like, yeah, no thanks, man. You could probably get into his computer and find out what he's doing if you tell the police. It's so funny. And then there was another guy there who also during CPR training kind of felt me up during CPR training, and I was thinking, is this guy gay? And he was an older guy, and I think he was just trying to gauge my reaction or something. But we were like, it was a test to feel around for a broken leg or something, and he was like running his hand on my thigh. This old 65-year-old guy. And the other guy who had offered me child pornography, after I turned him down, he drove off, and I could see that he was angry. He had a big black SUV. And most of the people working the job were drunks or whatever. So, but and then a couple months later, well, before that, I should mention this. It was around that time, right around the time I started working at Severstal, that I started my blog, which is called communicationbysymbol.blogspot.com. And I wrote a post about MSNBC and breaking news. I didn't think anybody was ever going to read it. It was just this kind of, overly, overly detailed, piece of kind of average writing about how they were using breaking news imagery and text to keep people from changing the channel. Which isn't, I don't think, news to that many people. Maybe to some people. I didn't think it was a big deal because I figured nobody would read it. And then I wrote something about John McCain and how he was, his eyes were pointed in a direction during Sarah Palin's speech that possibly suggested that he was looking at her rear end. It was all meant kind of in jest. And as I said, I don't think anybody ever would have read it if my life hadn't gone so haywire right after I posted those things. And so I was under the impression that that's why it was all happening. And who knows, maybe it is still. I don't know. I post something bad about MSNBC. I post something bad about John McCain. Next thing you know, somebody's trying to entrap me for pedophilia. You tell me. MSNBC is pretty well known for going after pedophiles. The next thing that happened at Severstal was that was probably the most significant event of them all was a guy named Wayne Cardarelli got hired to relieve me when my shift ended at 11:30 every night. I knew something was wrong when Wayne pulled up in a brand new, shiny, black Jeep Cherokee, and he got out of the car and he had that stupid cop swagger going, and he came into the thing. I'm thinking to myself, what's going on here? Because he did not fit the typical profile, if you will, of the people who were working that job. And sure enough, he started dropping some hints to me that he was investigating me for something. He said that he was a retired sheriff's deputy, and I'm thinking, wow, what's going on here? He started asking me these twisted questions, and like he was trying to get into my head to make me feel like he and I were friends, while he was really using these kind of really disturbing interrogation techniques. And he showed me a picture of how he was in a car accident with a knee injury, and I was in a car accident when I was in high school, and I had a knee injury later. And that's one of the things they do. They try to, present you with a list of things that you have in common. And that's one of the ways they screw with you. Guys that I meet randomly on the sidewalk now, that's how they screw with you. And then they ask you the same questions over again. I've been asked where I'm from like a couple thousand times by these idiots. But anyway, I could see that Wayne was investigating me for something, and I didn't know what it was. I'm thinking, what's going on with this? And around that time, I told him that I was going to be heading to New York for a friend's wedding. And when we had that conversation, I said to him, I'd never gone to New Year's Eve when I lived in New York, and I was thinking about making a trip to New York for New Year's Eve on New Year's Eve '07. Or no, it was '08, I'm sorry. It was '08 that year. And when I said that to him, Wayne wasn't very tall, like many of the people in my situation, including my brother and quite a few others. When I said that to him, he stood up on his tiptoes nearly, puffed up his chest as big as he could, and said in his biggest, baddest cop voice he could muster, "That'd be a good opportunity for a terrorist attack, eh, John?" And, I just couldn't believe my ears. It was, you've got to be joking. You don't actually suspect me of that, right? But that was how it sounded to me. Now everything that they're doing to me is they kind of bait you by suggesting things, etc. And they want to make me think that. A major thing that they're doing to me is to keep me confused and scared. And that's what's been pretty much the ongoing theme of it. But nevertheless, I went home that week and I was just, scared out of my mind, thinking, why is this guy suggesting to me that I'm suspected of terrorism? And it was then that I remembered a flight or a trip I made to Florida to visit my brother with my mother in 2003, and I'll get to that in the next section. Okay, so I mentioned to you that a guard at Severstal, who was kind of screwing with my head, made it clear to me that he was investigating me for something, apparently. Made a comment to me insinuating that I was suspected of terrorism. He shouted at me when I told him I was considering going to New York to Times Square for New Year's Eve. He shouted at me, "That'd be a good opportunity for a terrorist attack, John." Wow, what could, that's so just utterly ridiculous. But nevertheless, he had me scared already, and that scared me even worse. So I started thinking, and I remembered a trip my mother and I made to Florida to visit my brother in 2003, which I'll describe to you now. But first, I'll say that this section of the video is sponsored by Keebler Fudge Stripes, the best cookie in the world. Anyway, Another thing I just wanted to say, if I seem depressed or maybe a little downbeat, more so than someone would usually see that you would see in a video, it's just because the emotional and psychological attack I've been under is intended to keep me depressed, and they're trying to drive me to suicide. Is actually what it is. So I'm doing my best to keep it as upbeat as I can. And the other thing is, I recently became ill, and it makes a major symptom of it is fatigue, and in the days when the symptoms are worse, it's pretty bad. I pretty much good for nothing but napping. And today is actually not too bad, but it always keeps me kind of fatigued. I either have MS or some sort of brain infection. I don't know. I went to my doctor for it, and she blows me off and treats me like shit. And some fireman came and harassed me when she said I needed to go to emergency because of a heart murmur, which is just a setup so this San Francisco fireman could come and like shove me before he walked out the door. All this ridiculous things that happened in my life. But I knew and she knew, and she said it in when I met with her after that, that I needed an MRI and to see a neurologist, and this was 2 weeks ago, and it still hasn't been scheduled yet. So that's kind of the story of my life. But anyway, so that's it. If I seem a little downbeat, I apologize. So anyway, my mother had ALS. She was diagnosed with ALS on April 20th of 2002. It was the day of the official diagnosis. Though they guessed, we all kind of knew that that's what it was going to be before that. She'd had 2 siblings that had it before her previously. And ironically, there was some talk around the family and guessing if maybe they were the subject of some sort of experiment as well. But apparently ALS is hereditary. I guess we can just leave it at that. But she passed on in December of 2003, and I lived with her and my father in that year throughout 2003. And during that time, my mother Nancy and I made I think 3 trips to Florida to visit my brother Joe in Clearwater, Tampa. He's a Scientologist, and this story is going to illustrate how I know he's. When I first looked back and figured out what was going on. So anyway, Nancy and I got to the airport at Pittsburgh, and we arrived at the ticket desk to get our tickets. And I had never flown with someone in a wheelchair before. ALS, it slowly paralyzes you. And she was kind of, I forget what stage she was at that point. It was all in the last year. So we got there, and they said that we had to stow her wheelchair and use an airline wheelchair. I'd never flown with someone with a wheelchair, so I thought nothing of it. Okay, whatever. In hindsight, I recall that it probably is significant that the wheelchair was ready to fall apart. It was a rickety wheelchair that may have been from 1960 surplus. I mean, it was so terrible. But I didn't think anything of it at the time. We just headed up to security. When we got to security, they had us stand off to the side, which again I figured was probably because of the wheelchair. And then I looked over to my right, and there were 2, as I recall, were sheriff's deputies who looked like about the size of Division I football linebackers, with their arms crossed, with very mean faces, looking at me like this. And they wouldn't stop looking at me. And that was unnerving. And they had me take my shoes off and all that, and I didn't think anything of that. I had no reason to suspect anything. So I was just all kind of wondering, like, well, is this just normal for everybody? Is it normal because we have a wheelchair? I didn't know what to think. And then, so they searched me, and then a female security guard came over and exceeded her bounds in frisking, quote unquote, Nancy to a degree that was nothing less than nauseating. She lifted up her breasts and felt around underneath them, stuck her hands in her crotch. It was, I couldn't believe I was seeing it. It was, molestation is an accurate word to use for it. and it was all kind of shock and awe to me, that's for sure. And again, I didn't have any reason to suspect anything. But immediately after that, security guard, who happened to be a lesbian, felt my mother up. A guy in line waiting for security, he was about fourth, another passenger. I guess he was probably about 40 years old. I was 32 or 33 at the time. Right after that woman got done feeling up my mother, he shouted out to me, "Well, aren't you going to do something?" And, obviously I wasn't going to do anything, but it was all very kind of confusing, etc. But I mention it because it's very significant. For later, I'll talk about the brainwashing I've been subject to and how they set you up with loneliness so that you're impulsive. And he was playing off on that. But anyway, we headed on to the plane, and we boarded first, which I figured was normal because Nancy was in a wheelchair. And someone helped me. I can't remember how close we got. I guess we got about to the door of the plane, and someone helped me to carry her on. And it was a 2-aisle plane, so there were 3 sections of seats. And we were in the middle section in the front row on the right. Okay, and there may have been a few rows of seats in front of us, or maybe it was the bulkhead right there. I don't recall exactly, but I know that there was a lot of space. There wasn't a row right in front of us, which I was happy about because I needed leg room. But before we got on, as we were boarding, there was a gentleman already seated, and he was in a seat about 4 rows behind us and about 3 or 4 seats to my left. And we sat down, and all these weird things were going on, and I turned slowly around and looked over my shoulder. And the guy sitting there already seated was wearing a dark blue sport coat, and he had like a marine haircut with a flat top, salt and pepper. I'd say he was about 45 or 50. He may have had some sort of pin on his jacket. I don't recall exactly. But he was visibly shaking and glaring at me like this. And sweat was coming down his forehead. And, I just, at this point I'm wondering, the whole thing was getting a little ridiculous. And I think maybe during the flight I glanced back again, and the same thing was going on. So, I had no reason to suspect anything, but it was all making me nervous as it's intended to do. It's shock and awe, that's for sure. So, we landed in Tampa, and we exited the plane last, which again I figured was normal procedure for someone with a wheelchair, and maybe it is. And the gentleman who was glaring at me and sweating and shaking remained in his seat. And he was actually, I'm sure, the last one to get off the plane. And as I think it was a co-pilot or maybe the pilot, I don't remember, helped me carry my mother off the plane. I think I was walking backwards. I'm not sure. But I don't remember. But we were passing by, and I glanced over as we passed. I glanced over at the guy who was glaring at me and shaking and sweating. And I saw him go like this. It was so obvious and visible. And as we were walking, the co-pilot who was helping me carry my mother looked over at the guy who was shaking and sweating and said, "No way. I don't believe it." Just like that. So, after that, Nancy and I arrived at baggage claim. And we got her wheelchair and our baggage off the turnstile thing. And the brake handles were missing from her chair. Now, the brake handles on the chair are like a metal stick, about yay long, maybe a foot long, maybe a little bit more. And they're bent on about a 10-degree angle in the middle. It was like hard steel, maybe that thick, And one end is dipped in rubber for the handle, and the other end sticks in a socket on either side of the chair. And they were missing. And at this point, this is ridiculous. So we went over to the airline desk, and I told him, like, the brake handles on my mother's wheelchair are missing. And the woman was very rude, and she just said to me, "We lost them." And at this point, I was getting a little pissed off, and I said, "Well, you better find them." And she and I think a guy were there at the desk, and they both walked away, and they came back 5 minutes later with the brake handles. So they were definitely lying about that. And then my mother and I went out, exited, the baggage area to where my brother was going to pick us up, and I didn't call him. And as we walked out, he pulled up exactly on time. I mean, we waited less than 60 seconds for him to pull up to pick us up, and I did not call him. And he got out of the car, walked around to the passenger side where we were standing. He looked at me, and he's taunted me with several cryptic hints over the years. He's a theatrical poser. He's the drama queen of all drama queens. And he looked at me with this kind of sly look, and he mockingly rubbed his chin and said, "Huh, you made it." Basically dropping a taunting hint to me, indicating that he'd framed me for terrorism. He was surprised that I survived the flight without getting shot in the back of the head by that guy that was sitting back there shaking and sweating. So, but it was all such a strange thing. I had no reason to suspect anything at the time. I had no idea what was going on. But again, as I said, after Wayne Cardarelli made some strange comments to me, I thought back and then remembered that trip to Florida, which, in hindsight, was apparently there's a reason that all of those strange things happened on that flight. I want to make one more point about the trip to Florida with Nancy that I think I forgot to make in the first video. She and I stayed in Florida for about a week. When I flew down for that flight, and the guy was sitting behind me on the plane, sweating and shaking, and everything else happened with the chair and security. And after the flight, the only thing that really stuck in my mind was what happened to Nancy at the security checkpoint. Everything else, I had no reason to suspect anything, so I just kind of, I just blew it all off. But the thing that happened to Nancy, obviously, was very offensive to her, and so it stuck in my mind. We stayed there for about a week, and we flew back to Ohio, and my brother Joe followed us up there. I think it was the very next day, or it was within the next few days. I don't recall exactly. But he flew right up there, and he said he had business or something. I don't know. And he was at the house when I told our dad, Joseph M. Zockley, about what happened at security at the airport, about what happened to Nancy. And, at the time, I couldn't believe his reaction, but again, I didn't know what was going on. But his response was, he looked maybe slightly confounded, and then he said, "I wouldn't worry about it, John." Those were his very words. And I think maybe I may have said something else. I don't recall, but then he added, with kind of a tone of disgust, "Tell your brother," and he was kind of like, very kind of dismissive, like he wanted the conversation to be over, and he seemed a little pissed off, even though he'd said I wouldn't worry about it. So my brother was there, and he came in the living room, and he was sitting down in the living room where I was, and when I told him, he didn't say anything, and he sat there for a few seconds, and finally stood up and walked out of the room, and didn't say a word in response to what I told him about what happened to Nancy at the security checkpoint when security basically molested her. So once again, at the time, I did know the significance of those things, but in hindsight, I know that Joe didn't say a word because he didn't want to take a chance on saying anything that might incriminate himself. If he would have said something, then he would have been, I don't know, he didn't want to get caught in a lie. He was afraid of saying anything that could be held against him. So basically he pled the fifth in our living room. And then my dad's reaction tells me that he knew about it as well, which tells me that my brother-in-law very likely knew about it as well. For a while there, I thought that my brother was probably did it all on his own and kept it secret from everybody, but then at some point I remembered that incident, and the significance of it. My dad said, "I wouldn't worry about it, John," and then said, "Tell your brother," and didn't seem concerned or didn't say anything that indicated he was concerned, but he seemed pretty angry about it and disgusted. And he said, "Tell your brother." So those two things, those are the pretty obvious upshot of that. I'm right about what I'm saying about my brother, and he didn't say anything at that point, basically as a way of pleading the fifth. He didn't want to say anything to incriminate himself. And B, my father's reaction indicated that he knew about it as well.